we see now full screen and check the sound.
Yes. Everything
Yes, full screen.
should work now.
Yes, full screen. Yes, we see full screen.
Then I will start. First of all, thank you very much for being given the chance to present on this wonderful conference. Hardly any other music analytical discipline is as polarizing as pitch class set theory. On the one hand, in the Anglo-American world, it has become an established standard in both specialist discourse and the university curriculum. A veritable cult apparently associated with it in US music theory in the 1980s can be inferred from the words of Alan Ford from the opening speech of the 10th Annual Conference of the American Society for Music Theory in 1987. Ford says, "I did not invent the unordered pitch class set. That was the creation of a far higher power." On the other hand, pitch cluster theory met with enormous resistance in the anti-systematic discourse of the post-war period in Europe, and especially in Germany, which was, at least at first glance, difficult to understand, both in terms of content and nature. Michael Scheuer describes this dilemma in the introductory chapter of his book Analyzing Atonal Music, published in 2008. The first section of this chapter bears the telling title, A Tale of Two Continents. In it, the author uses an anecdote that took place at the 4th European Analysis Conference at the Conservatory in Rotterdam, Netherlands, to describe the existing dilemma surrounding pitch class set theory. Firstly, the late arrival of an anonymous US-American conference participant during a panel discussion on the analysis of contemporary post-tonal music is described. After listening for only a short time, it continues, he raised his hand and asked the question, "You guys are discussing methods of analyzing 20th century music. Why don't you talk about pitch class sets?" Scheuer continues, the chairman, a professor from the Sorbonne, was quick to respond, "We don't talk about pitch class sets because we don't hear them." The ineffectiveness of this answer needs no further elaboration, for the fact that we are still talking about pitch class sets after almost a quarter of a century is proof enough of the value of this analytical tool. In the following, I would like to try to get to the bottom of the causes of this polarization as far as this is possible. In doing so, I would like to trace a history of the reception and re-reception of ideas developed step by step over several centuries on two continents. Starting with the development of pitch class set theory in the USA in the 1940s, I will first follow a timeline backwards to the 19th century and even further back. At the end, aware of this tale of two continents, to cite Michael Scheuer once again, I would like to briefly outline the status quo of pitch class set theory in Germany, as well as the potential of its analytical discipline for the present and the future in international discourse. Pitch class set theory was developed in the United States in the 1940s. Pioneers of this discipline included George Pearl, Milton Babbitt, and Alan Ford. Two factors played a decisive role in the development of a discipline located between music and mathematics. One, the emerging computer age. At least in the early days of pitch class set theory, there was a vision of being able to analyze musical scores in the future using computers, which at the time were still space-filling machines with a very low memory capacity that is unimaginable today, and which had to be fed with punched cards. You see one famous colleague here in front of such a machine. Alan Ford even developed his own programming language named Snowball, the functionality of which he published in an article. The fact that this vision, one might say fortunately, was not to be fulfilled, need not be explained in detail from today's perspective. However, pitch cluster theory was to prove its usefulness and informative value for post-tonal, especially pre-dodecaphonic music of the second Viennese school in the future, and continue to have a great influence on the analysis discourse surrounding this oeuvre to this day. 2. The presence of Arnold Schönberg. Schönberg, who lost his position as professor of composition at the Sternsches Konservatorium in Berlin, immediately after Adolf Hitler came to power as Reich Chancellor, emigrated to the USA. In fact, the development of set theory, respective pitch class set theory, is linked to 12-tone theory and Schönberg's ideas on this topic in particular. The composer was now able to teach and disseminate his theories personally through lectures and classes at US universities. This already reveals the first direct European roots or predecessor models of pitch class set theory in the history of ideas. That can be vividly illustrated by Schönberg's music theoretical and compositional theoretical English language terminology, which has been constantly developing since he moved to the USA, but also by the conceptual ideas of 12-tone and row-based composition, as well as post-tonal composition in the run-up to dodecaphony. For example, the term row goes through several stages of development. While Schönberg initially chooses the term row as a literal translation of the German word Reihe, he later opts for the word series, which already comes much closer to his concept in the context of composing with 12 equal tones, but is still not completely satisfactory for him. Finally, allegedly at the suggestion of George Pearl, he uses the word set, since Schönberg's 12-tone rows are basically unordered groups of tones, and thus, by definition, pitch class sets. The chromatic total is achieved at the beginning of Schönberg's dodecaphonic creative period by a special arrangement of 3 tetrachords, and a little later from the variations of Opus 31 onwards by 2 hexachords, each of which complements the other to form a chromatic total. The hexachordal row technique was extensively studied by several music theorists, including Milton Babbitt, and labeled combinatoriality. Its preliminary form with the 3 tetrachords can also be described with this term. It is used in the suite for piano, Opus 25, a work that represents Schönberg's earliest composition organized entirely in 12 tones. If the waltz from Opus 23 was written even earlier according to the history of its composition. Schönberg used this suite in a text originally written in German to illustrate his method with 12 tones related only to each other. This is my own translation. The original term in German is Methode der Komposition mit 12 nur aufeinander bezogenen Tönen. This is how Schoenberg originally called it. It emphasizes that every note within a row, respective within a set, is treated equally, respective has equal musical rights. The misunderstanding of the concept of a row as a linear phenomenon is rooted in several European 12-tone textbooks of the post-war period, in particular the publications of Herbert Eimert, Hans Jelinek, and Ernst Krzenek, who was even a student of Schoenberg, should be mentioned in this context. The concept of a row as a primarily or even exclusively linear contrapuntal phenomenon never actually existed, at least in relation to Schoenberg's 12-tone technique. Rather, the arrangement of the 12 tones using 3 4-tone pitch class sets shows the possibility of a harmonic and contrapuntal encounter of all possible row tones. Motivic ideas and compositional ideas for the reorganization of traditional forms, such as the suite or the sonata form, are particularly prominent at the beginning of Schoenberg's 12-tone phase. This goes so far that even within a tetrachord, the order of the notes can be interchanged in favor of a consistent sequencing, as the bars from the musette of the piano suite shown in the slide demonstrate. We now hear the opening bars from this composition. Unordered groups of notes or pitch class sets also play an essential role in pre-dodecaphonic concepts of material arrangement. Arnold Schoenberg's piano piece, Opus 23, number 2, for example, consists entirely of subsets taken from a superset or the musical Keimzelle, which is exposed at the beginning of the piece. The composition is de facto a compositional realization of the relationships between supersets and subsets described in later series by Alan Ford and other authors, whereby freely atonal and sequentially bound sections alternate in this work. Let us now listen to the opening bars of the piece using the score with the corresponding analytical entries. Joseph Matthias Hauer's tropes also represent unordered groups of 6 tones that complement each other to form a chromatic total. In this respect, Schoenberg's and Hauer's approaches to 12-tone technique are even similar. In the context of the bitterly fought so-called priority dispute over the question of which of the 2 Viennese composers had discovered his respective method of 12-tone composing earlier, there would certainly have been agreement from a set-theoretical perspective. Hauer published his series in 2 self-published works. His pathetic, sometimes cryptic writing style makes the small books difficult to understand and may have prevented an even wider reception. However, the roots of pitch class set theory go back even further in history. A more or less rigorous generation of music theorists exists in the second half of the 19th century, among them, for example, Carl Friedrich Weizmann, a quite close friend of Franz Liszt, Friedrich Zamina, Friedrich Wilhelm Opelt, Joseph Anton Singer, and finally Heinrich Joseph Vincent, whose actual surname was Vincent Hörlein, though he never used this name for any publication. In my presentation, I would like to concentrate now on that Vincent, as his ideas seem to be most rigorous and far-reaching, partially even appearing as a look into the future. They also seem to me very refreshing, as they don't seem much influenced by any chains of historicity. My intention is not to judge Vincent's ideas, neither in a positive nor in a negative way, but to show some interesting, conscious or not conscious relationships between him and other theorists of other eras, relationships which seem to show that music theory comes on different levels always back to the same problems. I believe that especially the nearer history of music theory, in particular the development of pitch cluster theory, has shed some new light on Vincent's ideas, which emanated in the second half of the 19th century. Heinrich Joseph Vincent was born in 1819 in Teilheim, a small town in central Germany. After having studied theology and law, he dedicated his life to music, which was his passion since he was a young boy. He sang and later conducted several choirs, even during his time as a student. It is documented that he had a beautiful voice and founded the Liedertafel in Würzburg, where he also studied. After giving up his studies in law, he was engaged as an opera singer on several stages, again Würzburg, Halle an der Saale, Schwerin, and Vienna. Besides that, he was a not very successful composer of a few operas and musical comedies, and also wrote a biography of Franz von Suppé. His radical views on the field of music theory were unique, but probably contributed to him becoming somewhat of an outsider. Beside a few magazine articles, Vincent published between 1860 and 1894 5 theoretical main writings that are listed on the slide. The title of the first one contains the straight motto, Kein Generalbass mehr, no figure bass anymore, and it is published anonymously, probably not completely without any reason. In the first chapter of this little brochure, Vincent compares music with the arts of painting and poetry. He considers it as unnatural if anybody would have the idea to ask a painter or poet to express his colors, words, or even single letters with numbers. But nevertheless, exactly that would be the content of figured bass. Vincent's thoughts about figured bass being old-fashioned and unnecessary are rooted in his very own understanding of rhamistic music theory. This shows his depiction of the G major chord, at first in the wrong old system and then in the more correct new one. These are citings by the author. Ludwig Holtmeier writes, Vincent's critique is based actually on a misunderstanding. Figured bass is for him the rhamistic theory, in this point mainly referring to the writings of Simon Sechter, the theory that has pushed away the figured bass teaching of the 18th and early 19th century. I agree to this fact, though in his earlier writings of the 1960s, Wächter is only mentioned very rarely. Regarding figured bass, Vincent refers in Kein Generalbass mehr to Ludovico Viadana, who would have suppressed his stenographic invention if he had known what misuse would evolve out of it. After the opening chapter, the author starts explaining somewhat cryptic laws of numbers, mathematical axioms, and progressions. He tries to transfer mathematical laws of unity to musical laws of unity. One page later, Vincent explains the circle of fifths, then comes soon to the overtone series and, of course, among other topics, to problems of enharmonic change. At this moment, it gets interesting again. His remarks lead Vincent to the conclusion, it would be good if we had only 12 names for the 12 notes due to the established temperature. The whole trouble of the orthographic gadget that is only existing for reasons of orthography at the end would be spared to us. He suggests to name the black keys on the piano after the letters I, K, L, M, N, or, without giving any real reason, only to use D flat, E flat, G flat, A flat, and B flat, no sharps. Such an emancipation of tone names falls under the term Solidarität, solidarity, used by Vincent. No note should have any advantages by having more names than other ones. By reducing the system of notes to 12 and by treating them as equal, Vincent anticipates some, not all, of course, but some fundamental ideas of later evolving 12-tone series. At this point, I would like to make a short excursus. It is worth mentioning that Vincent presents the picture of a new keyboard in the earliest of his 5 main writings. This keyboard consists of a permanent change of black and white keys, the places where only 2 white keys appear in the normal keyboard, E and F, as well as B and C, are missing. It is described as very practical for playing scales. The chromatic scale would be, of course, without any difficulties anymore. Furthermore, the major scales are reduced to 2 schemes, either 3 white and 4 black keys or 4 white and 3 black keys. Vincent is sure that the near future will accept this new keyboard, although his radical changing of the tone names will cause more difficulties. Vincent's writing Neues musikalisches System, New Musical System, from 1862 refers directly to Kein Generalbass mehr, which I have discussed now. Its intention is to render a more detailed version of the thoughts he had previously introduced. However, the idea of the new keyboard is missing in it. It should take 13 years until Vincent finally dedicated a complete work to this topic in 1875, die Neuklaviatur, ihre Vorteile gegenüber den Nachteilen der alten. The new keyboard, its advantages in comparison to the disadvantages of the old one. It might be the case that Vincent has been somewhat inspired by ideas of other theorists of his time when developing his new keyboard, especially by a so-called Karl Bernhard Schumanns and his work Vorschläge zu einer gründlichen Reform in der Musik, Suggestions for a Fundamental Reform in Music, published in 1859, 1 year before Vincent's first writing appeared. Schumann's graphic on page 11 shows some similarities to Vincent's presentation. On the slide, both graphics are shown, one underneath the other. Vincent writes that both he and the physician Karl Bernhard Schumann, living in the small town Rhinow, Brandenburg, near Berlin, had invented the new keyboard at the same time, later on admitting that Schumann's writing had been published earlier than his own. In 1843, William A.B. Lunn had already written a paper dealing with a sequential keyboard, which was nearly identical to Schumann's and Vincent's. Lunn used the pseudonym Arthur Walbridge for his publication. However, Vincent's proposal of a new system in music theory went even further. Robert Wasson mentions that in a writing of 1900, Vincent had suggested a new way of musical notation. It has been documented that Vincent had written a letter to Richard Wagner in which he presented him his new radical ideas. Wagner's reaction was none. A fine overview about the history of the development of new keyboards and systems of notation in the 19th century is given in Otto Quandts Work zur Geschichte der neuen chromatischen Klaviatur und Notenschrift, which appeared in Berlin in the year 1877. But let us end this excursus and go back to Vincent's writing of 1862, New Musical System. This even more emphatic writing, which he then published not anonymously anymore, and in which he states, for example, that a musical Galileo is still missing, once again harshly renounces figure-based. It does, however, contain some interesting concepts of presenting chords, mainly consisting of 3 or 4 notes on circles. Vincent uses the names triangle and square for the augmented triad and the diminished 7th chord, sounds that are symmetric ones in the geometrical sense. He points out that the symmetry of the eye does not correspond to the symmetry of the ear. The geometric figures are based on a clock-like system of numbers representing the 12 tones. As a point of reference, the note C is placed at the position of the full hours. A geometric representation of a chord contains, beside its original appearance, all its inversions and, if this circle is revolved, all transpositions and, of course, all the transpositions of its inversion as well. Furthermore, with such a geometric appearance of a sound, nothing is said about whether the notes it is consisting of are played simultaneously or successively. This way, Vincent's figures entail some of the main attributes of an unordered group of notes that later generations of music theorists have called a pitch class set. Robert Wasson shows himself a little disappointed, and I totally agree with him that Vincent, as well as his contemporary Carl Friedrich Weizmann, were not interested in geometric sounds containing more than 4 notes. One last futuristic aspect of Vincent's later period should be mentioned, though this aspect has been already pointed out in the works of Robert Wasson and Catherine Nolan. In the writing, Ist unsere Harmonielehre wirklich eine Theorie? Is our harmony teaching really a theory? From 1894, Vincent comes really close to pitch class set theory by using its system of numbers. 0 for C, 1 for C sharp or D flat, 2 for D, etc. This way, the C major chord in example appears not as 1, 3, 5, or 3, 5, 8, like in the old system of figure bass, but as 0, 4, 7, representing the subclass 311. Remarkable is the correspondence between the circle of fourths and the circle of fifths expressed in numbers of the new system. This is a procedure that is called modulo 12 in mathematics, and that is again one of the basic tools of pitch class set theory. The phenomenon of futuristic music theory in the second half of the 19th century was by no means limited to the German-speaking world. The writings of the French customs official, music theorist and publicist Anatole Lequin should also be mentioned here. In particular, his Notions élémentaires d'harmonie moderne, published in Paris in 1862, and the work entitled L'algèbre de l'harmonie ou une révélation dans la science des accords, also published in Paris without a date. The subtitle of the latter work in particular, Traité complet d'harmonie moderne, sans note de musique ni signe équivalent, avec des nombres pour représenter les combinaisons harmoniques et des lettres pour exprimer les successions mélodiques, is revealing with regard to the significance of Lequin's various concepts and intellectual approaches in connection with the emergence of pitch class set theory. The author also published an essai philosophique sur la tonalité moderne from 1864 to 69 and a work entitled Tableau de tous les effets harmoniques de 1 à 5 notes, published in 1874. To date, little research seems to have been done on Lequin as a French source of ideas of North American pitch class set theory. But let us return to the circles of Heinrich Joseph Vincent, by means of which he systematically, graphically depicted sounds and musical material. Systematizations have probably existed at all times. One of the earliest approaches of this kind was probably provided by the theorist Johannes Lippius in his Synopsis Musicae Novae. In terms of its content and methodological approach, Lippius' treatise largely represents a compendium of musical practice that was common at the time it was written. However, the doctrine of double counterpoint, to which many authors devote themselves at the end of similar works, is replaced in Lippius' work by a chapter characterized by revolutionary ideas. His approach is also based on a circular diagram that serves to visualize all possible intervals within the Ionian scale, which in Lippius' work functions as a material background. A line between two tones now results in an interval class in the sense of pitch class set theory, as it graphically realizes both an initial interval and its complementary interval. But Lippius' approach is even more far-reaching. More than a century before, Jean-Philippe Rameau's Traité d'harmonie réduite à ses principes naturels, he recognized the sixth chord and the fourth sixth chord as inversions of the triad by describing them as leading to an identical geometric figure. The above considerations lead to the conclusion that pitch class set theory, which originated on the US American continent and subsequently spread worldwide from there, is by no means an original creation, but is inconceivable without historically far-reaching models on the European continent. It is also impossible to imagine its development in the way it took place without reference to global political and technical events. As a result of these events, music theory research has been divided into a specifically European and an Anglo-American strand. While the European research community, as a result of the disastrous initial situation in large parts of mainland Europe, tended to be critical of any form of systematics and dogmatics and instead strongly emphasized the individualism of works in music analysis, this reluctance did not exist in North America, which was much less affected by the Second World War. The Schenkerian system for tonal music can become established and institutionalized at US colleges and universities. Schenker's own problematic and highly remarkable relationship to the National Socialist regime can be slowly but steadily depolitized, as it were, with a sufficient geographical safety, distance, and develop in this form. For post-tonal music, the pitch set theory, which was available in a teachable form in the 1960s, represented a welcome and very suitable counterpart to layer theory in the university curriculum, especially as Schoenberg himself as a source of inspiration and at least in part probably also to be inspired, was ultimately in the immediate vicinity. It should be mentioned that Alan Ford, whose 1973 book The Structure of Atonal Music is perhaps the best known internationally recognized standard work of classical pitch set theory, was a Schenkerian in his early days. His first book publication dates back to 1955 and is entitled Contemporary Tone Structures. One searches in vain for set theoretical content. Instead, the author deals with the question of how the graphic analysis methods of Schenkerian theory can also be applied to post-tonal repertoire. Linear contrapuntal aspects of the analyzed works take center stage, an aspect to which Ford was to return in his very late publications. This book publication is spectacular because Ford took an arch-conservative stance in the decades that followed in the midst of an emerging bitter dispute between the revisionists among the Schenkerians and the orthodox traditionalists. The Travis-Ford debate in particular, a verbal dispute between the composer and music theorist Roy Travis and Ford himself, involving several mutual attacks and counterattacks, is legendary. Away from the US continent, such debates must have seemed very foreign, very strange, which may be one of the main reasons why European music theory was generally skeptical of the US research community and its discourse. Pitch cluster theory was included in this research establishment and was also still the great unknown with hardly any awareness of its European roots. In 2007, I had the honor of exchanging a few emails with Alan Ford, courtesy of Janet Schmalfeld. In one of these emails,
Biraz
Ford,
abi burada. Bu katılımcılar arasında.
excuse me, in one of these emails, Ford casually summarizes the gap between the two continents, which remained almost unchanged then, as it does today in 2024, when he mentions his former doctoral student Janet Schmalfeld and her dissertation, which deals with a set theoretical analysis of Alban Berg's opera Wozzeck. Kenneth Schmalfeld's study was the first and still the best large-scale analysis of a major non-tonal work, Ford writes. He continues, I have suggested to Janet that she might do something with Olivier Messiaen's music as well, which I believe remains untouched, since the French seem to be behind the times in analytical matters, although some of the younger scholars have removed the blinders. This description may sound arrogant at first glance, and it was never intended for the public. I apologize. Nevertheless, there might be something true in it. However, the French colleagues may not have been exclusively unfamiliar with or not interested in pitch cluster theory or blind to it from Ford's point of view. Rather, the situation in Germany is equally. Publications on pitch cluster theory by German-speaking authors appear comparatively late. Their number is extremely small, and they are sparsely received. Their supposed lack of musicality and analytical errors are often criticized in specialist circles. To quote the title of a famous essay by Schoenberg, I personally also found my path, how one becomes lonely in the context of these works. Nevertheless, in these times of globalization and the internationalization of musicological and music theoretical discourse, with its growing interest in intercultural and ethnomusicological research, pitch cluster theory has a great potential. Depoliticized in its current generation and hopefully not repoliticized in the context of current global and regional political events, there are many directions in which it might develop further. This primarily concerns the expansion of its analytical tools. Set theoretical systematics can potentially also be designed beyond the scales of Western music. Algorithms can also be transferred to other musical parameters, to the level of rhythm, timbre, dynamics, articulation, etc. A much larger repertoire of music is waiting to be systematically analyzed in a way that is by no means remote from music and ahistorical, and in this way to find its deserved place in the focus of current international discourse. To remove the blinders, that could be a hopeful motto for the future of set theory in the context of a tale with its tail from two continents. Thank you very much.
Yes, Stephan, thank you very much. And it's very interesting presentation, fascinating, thought-provoking, and I think that the audience will have some questions.
Dear Kavasa, firstly, translate in Turkish little bit.
Gwansa, in order to communicate with the audience much better, I'm gonna translate it into Turkish a bit, and then just like not very much, if you permit, Stefan, with your permission, I will translate your pinpoints. So bear with me a second. Aslında Stephan Lewandowski ses sınıfı işte küme teorisi bizim de yine pitch class teori olarak bildiğimiz aslında direkt aldığımız Alman ve Fransız ekollerinde ilk baştaki reddini neden reddedildiğini, neden benimsenmediğini